And now on the line is Paul Ginnell. Paul is the Director of the European Anti-Poverty Network Ireland, or EAPN Ireland. Paul, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much, Darren.
Paul, I last spoke to you on Near FM in the run up to the last general election, which was around 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
I believe that your work has changed. Has changed in the last couple of years for a couple of reasons in particular. I'm not sure if you remember our last interview on Near FM, but Paul, can you give me a picture of how your work has changed since our last interview during the last general election?
Yeah, I guess in a state that time, just before the last general election, we were, I suppose, in a positive place as a society. We were kind of well over the previous recession, and there were a lot more investment, I suppose, happening in society and so on. But also, I suppose we were very conscious that still a lot of people hadn't benefited from the recovery that was put in place at the time. But we were optimistic, I suppose. But since then, of course, we've gone through two major crises, and we're still in the middle of the cost of living crisis, and that's having a major effect on households and people across the country, really in terms of their ability to make ends meet.
Yeah, and you issued a report in the last few weeks, didn't you?
That's right, yeah. So I suppose this is something that we were actually conscious of even before COVID crisis began, is that we were hearing from member organisations in different communities that there were people and families who were going to charities and different community organisations looking for support with basic needs such as food, support with different clothing and so on. And also we were conscious that there were food banks developing in different communities as well, which is a concern really if people are depending on those food banks and different supports for ongoing basic needs. So anyway, that was an idea, that something we were thinking about then. Then, of course, COVID came, and then we have the current cost of living crisis. But it's something that we've been very conscious of, and it's, I suppose, become a lot worse, that so many more people are now depending on food banks and charities just to make ends meet. So the report we published a few weeks ago was looking at the impact of that on households and on the community groups that are providing those supports. So it is a major concern. I think it's something that everybody's conscious of around the place, that that there are more food banks, that there are more people who can make ends meet, so are going to those charities and organisations. So it has a major impact. Like the report found that, I suppose not surprisingly, that when people are depending on those supports, it has a major impact on their own dignity and their own self-value and self-worth. So in reality, while they provide an important service, they're not really a good thing to have as a long-term kind of solution in our society to people's need to make ends meet. So, and also for the community organisations themselves, it's a bit of a problem too, that while organisations want to help people and need to help people, they want to be doing other work. They want to be doing the broader supports to, around society and building up more inclusive societies and societies where we don't really have poverty, but they're finding themselves on the front line acting as charities, some that are not even, I suppose, set up in that way, and we're aiming to do other types of work around, say, childcare or employment or other supports within the communities.
Is the cost of living crisis, Paul, in your opinion, that we have at the moment comparable to the Great Recession that we had?
Yeah, it's I suppose it is in many ways. What we saw during the previous crisis is that about a third of the population ended up experiencing some level of material deprivation. So it's not at that level yet, but we're definitely heading back there in some ways. So the CSO, they produced their information on the levels of deprivation a few weeks ago, and it showed that there was an increase of about 100,000 people experiencing deprivation between 2021 and 2022. So it's gone up now to about over 17% of the overall population, or over 870,000 people are in experiencing deprivation. So it is a big concern. as I said, it was something we were already aware of, that people had difficulties making ends meet. But now, of course, it's becoming a growing crisis for far more people in society. And the CSO also highlighted that about half of the people in the country are having some difficulty in making ends meet, particularly those that are in, say, rental accommodations and so on as well. They're particularly badly hit. Because this is very much linked to other issues like the housing crisis and so on as well. So while there are certain challenges around energy and those costs now and food costs, that there were ongoing issues with cost of housing and childcare, other costs like that, which are having an impact as well, an ongoing impact.
What would you say to the argument, Paul, that since COVID-19 and the cost of living crisis, that the government have not really made any cutbacks in public health spending and have indeed increased public spending, so that basically we can't really blame the government for the cost of living crisis and how they have responded to it? What would you say to that argument?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's a number of things. One is that I suppose traditionally Ireland has a low level of investment in services. So, whether it's housing or care, transport, and so on. Apart from education, I think when you compare us to other countries, we have a very low level of investment. So, where we're coming from in terms of our investment is kind of way behind where other countries are at. So, there was always a need to ramp up. And in housing in particular, it was obviously during the recession over 12 or 13 years ago, investment in housing had almost come to a standstill. So we're starting from a very low base when we're talking about increases in spending. Also, I suppose there are different issues in terms of how we provide services in Ireland, and you mentioned health in particular. So we know that we have, I think it's very clear that we have a very broken model of health service in Ireland, the two-tier health system, where, people with health insurance pay quite a lot for their services outside of the public system. But they can get past people in the public system then who are on medical cards and so on in terms of access to services. So it's a very unfair system, and the government has a sláinte care proposals on the table, and to try and implement the reforms to bring about a single tier health system. But that will need major investment if it's going to take place. And there is investment. We see a lot of new primary healthcare centres, a lot more new services in the communities and so on as well. But there are major challenges to making sure that the reforms that are needed there kind of move forward quite a lot, and make sure that people can access the health service, the healthcare that they need when they need it, and it's not based on their levels of income, but based on their need. And that's the model that is being developed at the moment, but it's moving slowly, much more slowly, I think, than a lot of people would hope for in coming to the system that we want. So yes, there is investment, that's for sure. But as I said, it's coming from a low base, and it's also the type of investment we have as well. Even in housing, where a lot of our housing investment is very much in, say, a lot of people in social housing are in private rental market. So they're getting supports, whether it's the housing assistance payment or on the rental accommodation scheme, to be able to stay in those houses. So the government is very much under pressure to build social and affordable housing, and that's where the investment needs to go, because that's the type of housing that remains in the control of the state. And the state has control over then the levels of rent that people are paying and the supports that people need to stay in those houses. So partially it's the investment, and then the other part of it is the type of model that we have, and that people can access services in a way that the state can support, and the state can assure that those people who are accessing it can afford the services they're getting.
Okay. I know that you and the EAPN are, of course, a European network. Can you tell me, Paul?
Yeah.
Can you tell me, Paul, about the kind of words or feedback that you are getting from your European colleagues in the EAPN about the cost of living crisis in their countries?
Yeah, it's definitely like a global crisis, so it's affecting people across the world, and all across Europe. So in similar ways, different people in countries are experiencing the same level of kind of inflationary crisis. Ireland is kind of in the middle. There are some countries at the lower end of inflation. Then there are other countries, for example, the Baltic countries around Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The levels of inflation they're having are double or treble what we have here. So in Ireland, we have inflation at around 9%, but in those countries, it's almost 30%. So it really is quite difficult for people in those countries in terms of affording the cost of living. Of course, they're on the borders or near Ukraine as well, and the direct impact of energy costs and different issues that impact on them because of that as well. So, yeah, it's different across Europe, but it's definitely quite a crisis, all across Europe in terms of the cost of living. The levels of poverty have, the EU agreed poverty reduction targets a few years ago to reduce the numbers of people experiencing poverty or social exclusion by 15 million by 2030. But already since 3 years since that's been agreed, there have been an increase of about 5 million people in Europe at risk of poverty or social exclusion. So definitely there's a challenge for governments to be able to respond, to put into place the supports people need to be able to afford the cost of living. But it's something that I think that governments need to face up to, because, as I said, we're seeing people who are just in now at very extreme levels of poverty who can't make ends meet. So it's a challenge. It definitely is a challenge across Europe, and there are a number of different challenges that they face. But I think the focus has to be on those who are on the lowest incomes in terms of ensuring that they can get through this period. And then look at the longer term needs of people as well. As I said, that there were already many people in our society who were challenged to make ends meet and to afford the basic essentials even before this crisis happened, and to have a decent standard of living. So these new crises add to that. But I think in time we need to get back to making sure that we have a society where everybody can live a decent life. Yeah. So that's something that we definitely need to aim towards and continue to focus on.
Okay, one thing that also encouraged me to contact you today for this interview, Paul, is that I believe that yourselves in the EAPN Ireland are big supporters of the Add the Tent campaign. I interviewed Dan Kenningham from ATD around the time of the 17th of October last about their support for this campaign. Can you tell me and our listeners today, Paul and the FM, about why yourselves in the EAPN support the Add the Tent campaign?
Yeah, it's so the Add the Tent campaign is around trying to ensure that socioeconomic status is added to a ground in our national equality legislation. So currently there are now 9 grounds in the equality legislation, and covering a range of different areas as well that people are discriminated on, different grounds people are discriminated on. But it doesn't include socioeconomic background. So if somebody is discriminated on because of their level of income, because of their address, because of their social welfare support, or unemployed and so on, there is no protection in the state for those people if they go for jobs or can't access services and so on, because of the stigma and the stereotyping maybe that people impose and discriminate against these people because of that. So what the Add the Tent Alliance has come together, there's about 7 organisations that have come together to form the alliance and to campaign for the inclusion of socioeconomic status as a ground in equality legislation. So it really is a very difficult situation for people who face this type of discrimination, and there's absolutely no protection in the state for them. So it's unacceptable. It's been going on since our equality legislation was agreed over 20 years ago. So it's about time that this is addressed and that ground is added to our equality legislation. We're actually at I suppose at a kind of a hopeful time in some ways now, because the government is currently reviewing our equality legislation and has kind of stated that it's open to the inclusion of the ground of socioeconomic disadvantage as a ground in that legislation. So we're hopeful that will happen. we just need to see progress. We need to see something significant to show us that that's actually going to happen and it's going to take place. But if that did happen, it would be very important for people in these communities, particularly that experience high levels of discrimination. So, and I think it's important as well from it's not just an individual level. So it wouldn't just be protecting people at an individual level, but it would also be a change of culture. I think in different institutions in different areas, where currently people face stigma and people face discrimination, that those institutions would have to change their cultures, how they treat people when they come in the door to access goods or services, or to access employment. So I think it's important not just at an individual level, it's important on a societal level and a cultural level, institutions as well, that we introduce socioeconomic status as a ground in our equality legislation.
Okay. Okay, Paul, we are close to the new year 2023. Can you tell me if you in the EAPN Ireland have any big or different plans in 2023 that our listeners might be interested in?
Yeah, I think that the report that we published, that I mentioned earlier, that we'll be looking at that a little bit more. I think why it's important, really, in a sense, is that we can't see food banks and people depending on organisations to meet basic necessities as being normalised in our society. So I think that's something that has to be looked at. I know the government itself is looking at this issue too. But we have to look at the other supports that people need in order to live with dignity in society. So, at some of the structural causes behind poverty that exist in our society, and we've been campaigning for a number of years around the benchmarking or setting of social welfare rates at a level that's adequate for people to afford the cost of living. So, in next year, we'll be continuing to campaign on that basis. To ensure that that everybody can have a decent income, whatever their source, whether it's from social welfare and employment, to live with dignity, and not to have to go to food banks or charities in order to supplement their income, just to live a decent life, or to make ends meet. So that's something we'll be continuing to do in the next year, and also the campaign we just mentioned on the socioeconomic status as a ground in equality legislation, that hopefully the government will be moving forward on that this year or next year, sorry, and when they kind of publish a little bit more on the review of the equality legislation. So, and hopefully other people will get behind the campaign too, in terms of ensuring that we have protection for people who, to make sure they can't be discriminated against because of their social background. That's something that needs to end, and something that I think a lot of people in society know is there, and a lot of people experience it. So it would be important for people to, support the campaign to end that type of discrimination and make sure that people have protection under the law.